Okay, so in this video, I'm going to show you how to create an API using Python and Flask framework. It's going to be great because you're going to learn all the skills you need to create your own API. And also it's going to open up more opportunities for you to be able to show off to potential employer or be able to do so for your own projects. Before we start coding, we need to understand the basics of an API. So an API stands for Application Programming Interface. So essentially, an API allows different software systems to communicate, enabling data exchange and functionality sharing without requiring a deep understanding of each other's code. So what that means is we use API to access data from different websites, from different systems, and have this exchange, this communication of data. And the thing about APIs is that the internet itself runs on APIs because we have these different systems that are running on different servers and different applications, different websites, different databases that are interconnected, and they're connecting with each other in the back end or in the background. So it's an important skill to understand how to build an API. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so as you can see here, I do have my Flask-API folder created. I'm going to go ahead and right click the first file, which is going to be the requirements.txt. So this is where we're going to put some requirements, dependencies, or libraries that we need for this application to work, this project. So in this case, it's going to be Flask. Okay, very good. But with any project, of course, any Python project, we need to create an environment which is going to allow us to install things, to create a sandbox per se where Python can run and we can do all the things. So it's very customary to do so. Open the terminal that I have here and I'm going to close that down. So I'm going to go ahead and create the Python environment real quick here. So I'm on Mac, so I'm going to say Python 3 and -m. I can never remember how to do this one, how to write this whole piece of code here, but there we go, venv. And then I'm going to give the name of the environment. So I'm going to just call this my env. That's fine. So right then you can see that it's going to create that, and I'm just going to go ahead and say yes because this environment was created and it's going to be the default environment. Okay, so we have our environment here. So because I have our requirements.txt here, I'm going to use it to add all of the dependencies, even though we'll only have this dependency here, this Flask. But I like doing this because it's just easier. We're going to go ahead and activate it. I'm going to say source and go, of course, to my env. That's the name of this environment folder that we created. And just go and say bin and find activate. Hit enter. And you can see that now our environment is activated. Very cool. So now we can go ahead and pull the requirements.txt and install the dependencies that we have here. So I'm going to say pip install -r requirements, and voila, it's going to go ahead and install our requirement. In this case, it's just Flask. Okay, that's all good. And now we are ready to go. So I'm going to get rid of that and close this down, and maybe close this down as well. Okay, first we can import a few libraries from Flask. So I'm going to say from, I'm going to import Flask itself. And we're going to use JSONify request, just JSONify. I think it's called JSONify. I always have issues saying that, JSONify. Or JSONify. JSON, is that JSONify? Well, doesn't matter. All right, so, and request as well. Okay, these are the libraries, dependencies that we need. Anytime we create a Flask application or project, we need to set up the main class, main app, so say app, and make sure that this app here has to be exactly the same as the app name that we created here. So if this was main, you should probably add main here. So I'm going to say app, I'm going to set that to Flask, and I'm going to pass the name as such. So I'm setting up the actual Flask object that will govern our entire application. And at the bottom here, I'm going to say if main, and then it has to be app.run. I'm going to pass debug to be true as such. Okay, so this is what we're doing here. We're saying app. This is our app, the Flask application we put it together, and .run, and we're passing debug to be true in debug mode. And if we want, we can also pass port here, but we're not going to do that. This is where we can start putting together the code, the actual Flask application, which is going to be an API. An endpoint is just a URL that gets to a certain place on our server and gets data in this case. That's what it is. So an endpoint in this case would be something like this, ID, okay? Or say users and then ID, something like that. So this would be an endpoint. All right, so in order to create an endpoint, we actually use a function. We define function, quotes, and this function here is not gonna have anything, we're not passing anything, and we're just gonna go ahead and return, in this case, something like says hello world. All right, that's it. But the problem with this is that as it is, this is not an API because we don't know, or Flask won't know what to really do with this. In order to make this an API, we need to pass a decorator here that will be the route of this path, right? So I'm going to say app, you pass app like this, and then say route. You can see the app is all the same, right? That's the beauty here. So the route, this is the route to where we want to have our endpoint. I'm just going to put / say quotes. So I'm saying here, if I go to quotes, I should see hello world. Now, how do we run such application, this project? Let's go ahead and open our terminal. To run this, we say Flask run. That's all you have to do. If you hit enter, this is what's going to happen. You can see now it's saying running on this local host on port 5000. Now, if you have a port that is already taken 5000, it should give you another port where it works. Or what you can do here, you can specify port and say 5001. Okay, so you can do that too. But by default, it goes to 5000. And that's a very good thing. Let's go ahead and see if this works. I can just click on this, which is going to open, in this case, a URL. And once that it's open, you can see that nothing is showing here. What's going on? Well, the reason being is because, well, we say the route has to be quotes, right? If I remove that and just leave that, if I save this, and I probably have to go ahead and stop this. I'll show you how to make this all automatic, and we run again. Come here, you can see that this is going to work and says hello world. Okay, so that is your API working. But with APIs, in this case, we want to make sure, in our case, we want to go to the quotes endpoint to get some information. So I'm going to go ahead and Control C again to quit. I'm going to clear, and I'm going to run once again. And you're going to see refresh. We're going to have not found because it doesn't know where to go to get that information until we say / quotes like that. And voila, you see we have hello world. Very good. So you've written your very first API. This is indeed a very simple API. Okay. Now, because we're talking about quotes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add sample data here with a couple of quotes. So we have a list of quotes with objects here, right? So we have ID, author, and quote. Instead of just returning hello world, because this is just not cool, we are going to use JSON-fi, I think that's how you say it, and pass our quotes, right? Which quotes? These quotes here. So what would happen now? I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now, you notice that every time we make changes here, and we have to go ahead and stop our server and then restart it. There's a better way to do that. I'm going to Control C. The better way to do this, when we say Flask run, that's what's giving this result, which means we have to stop everything and then we run again to see the changes. But you can say Flask --debug and run like this, and voila. Now every time we make changes, let's say false, for instance, it's going to go ahead and reload itself, and our application here should work. If I refresh here, you can see now we have this very cool API endpoint that is showing me this JSON here, which is exactly what we have for our data that we put here of quotes. So very good. Now, usually what you want to do, because you see here we say just quotes, this is using a method called get. So usually, or implicitly in this case, in the background, it has this method here that is already being added, which we pass as an array and is called get. So either way, in this case here, it will assume that you're doing the same thing. That's why it still works. So if I save this again, nothing will change here because it's still the same thing. But it's important to always add the methods to say we want to do a get request. Go to the server, a get something. Okay. All right. So we have the first here. This is a get. How about if we want to get a specific quote? We can see this quote, each quote here has an ID. How do we do that? Well, we have to write yet another endpoint, another function, another route, as they call it. So for the route, it's going to be quotes. And then I'm going to pass inside of angular brackets the type, which is going to be int, right, and ID, something like this. So we can say this is going to be an int ID. I'm going to remove that. So it's going to be an ID type int, which means anytime we want to get, let's say, quote with ID 1, we should pass /1 as such. Okay. If I do that right now, it's not going to work. That is the idea. Now, what do we do next? Well, next we define the actual function quote, and naming is very important because this one can say get quotes, plural, because it's getting everything. This is going to be get quote. But we also have to remember what kind of methods we are going to pass here. So methods, and of course, yes, still going to be a get. What we need to pass inside here is going to be an ID. So that means whenever this is called, we're going to pass an ID. So we are able to get the actual one ID that needs to be get. So to get a quote by its ID, we say quotes, actually just quote because we're just getting one. And then I'm going to write here, and then I'm going to use the next method here, which allows us to iterate through whatever we're going to pass inside here. Now I'm going to use this very awesome syntax here. I'm going to say Q for Q in quotes, right? I'm going to say if Q ID is equal to ID. Now, all we're doing here is that we're going to iterate through this quotes list here that we have, and it's going to check to see for each quote that we're getting, the ID of each quote is equal to the ID that we're passing here. That's how we retrieve what we need. Okay, once we do that, then we're going to return again, use JSON-fi, I think that's where we say it, and I'm going to pass the quote. And in this case here, I'm going to say if quote, else I'm just going to go ahead and pass an empty string and a 404. So these are numbers to say that something has happened. Okay, all right, let's see if this works. I'm going to save this. Okay, so now if I go here and put /1, hit enter, voila, you can see that we have one quote. Very good. So we have our quotes. So this is the get quotes, so everything, and we just finished putting together the get quotes, or rather get quote, because we're just passing the ID to retrieve just one quote. Next, let's go ahead and look at ways in which we can add a quote into this sample data. Now this is very simple because we're just using a very simple array here, a list, but you can imagine that a sample data, or where we're going to be putting the data, right, more quote or another quote, would be a database or a file system of some sort. But we're just making things a little bit simpler for this, just for this video. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. I just want you to keep in mind that most of the things that you do are literally just a repetition, right? So we're going to repeat the same thing again, create our app or route, and then we're going to pass this new route here. So it all starts from quotes, as you can see. We're also going to pass the methods array. Now we're going to say we want this to be post. So what is this post method? The post method, as the name implies, allows us to post something or to send something to the server so that it can be saved. As I said, in this example here, we're very simple. We don't have a database per se, but the same concept of posting something to our sample data array list here would be the same if we had a database. Quote, and then that's about it. We didn't need to pass any argument or any parameter because it doesn't matter. All right, so what we do, I'm going to say new quote. Now, how do we get this new quote? Because we want to add essentially something exactly like this with an ID, author, and quote. How do we do that? Well, in this case here, because this is post, we're actually going to be able to retrieve that from our request object, which in this case, you can say we imported here from our Flask. So this library allows us to generate, in this case, a request, and which will have different pieces of data that we are retrieving for, in this case, could be from a form, a web form, or any other means. Okay, so I'm going to use that request, and then I'm going to invoke the JSON. Okay, so now I'm going to say quotes that append. In this case, we're going to append this new quote, which we are retrieving from our request object. And then I'm going to return back to the browser that new quote that we've added so that we know that something was added. So I'm going to just say JSON-fi, and I'm going to pass the new quote. And then I'm going to return the 201 to say something was saved, something is good. Okay, now here's the thing. In order for us to test this out, a post request, we can't do that on a browser because it doesn't work. So we have to have some sort of HTTP request client. And the one I'm going to be using is Postman. What you do is you pass the exact URL that you have here. This is going to be your local host. So just copy everything there and then put it all here. And make sure, of course, to put the actual endpoint. And we can change the methods here. We've seen get. In fact, if I go to get and go to quotes, in this case, it's going to go enter and see exactly the same thing we saw before, or we saw here on the browser. Let me go back here because our application is still running. Oops. Let's remove that. And you can see the same thing we're seeing here. So get works here on the browser, but post wouldn't work, as I say. That's why I'm using this client here. And you can see that we have our result here. And so you can change the method. So we want post and it's still the same endpoint. But the other thing we need to do here is we need to pass a body. So we're going to click a body here, pass in as a JSON here. So it's raw, right? Go find raw. And then here you can change for text and everything, but we want JSON because that is the type that needs to be passed in order for us to save it. And I already have here, this is a JSON and I need to put an ID 3. And let's see if this works. So I have the body that needs to be post, right? And then what will happen is that we're going to get that body. Okay. In this case, request a JSON into the quote, new quote, and then that's what we're going to be appending into our quotes. Okay. Let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and say send, and voila. Once you do that, you will see that if I go back here, you can see that indeed this is 201 created out 6 milliseconds that it took to do that, which is good. That means it worked perfectly, and we have ID 3 here. This is what comes back from the server per se once everything was added. All right, so there we go. If we were to add something else, I'm going to change this to for something new, James Bond, and gonna send. And if we go back to the bottom here, you can see indeed James Bond for something new. And then we have the 201 again. All right, so next let's learn how to delete an item. Well, to delete, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to just go real fast, create our route or root. And then I'm going to say quotes. And also in order to delete something, we need an ID. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. It's going to be an int ID type right here. I'm going to pass methods. It has to be delete as such. And now I'm going to define the actual function that will run once we hit this root quote, and we need to pass an ID. Because of the nature of things, we have this quotes sample data there. I'm actually going to use this global keyword and say quotes. In this case, that way we're going to have access to the quotes list, right? So this is just something that would work in our case here. And I'm going to create again or use the list comprehension, right? Syntax, very strange, but it's very simple to conceptualize. So I'm going to say Q for Q in quotes. So if Q ID is not equal to ID. So what we're doing here is that we're actually removing the quote which contained the ID that is being passed there from the quotes. In this case, this quotes sample data list of quotes. Okay, and so then I'm going to return this and 204 like that. Let's go ahead and save this and see if this works. And what I can do now, just using our Postman here, I can do the same thing. I'm going to change this to delete. And we say that it has to be this URL here, endpoint, and then I have to pass ID. So let's say I want to delete 1. Okay, make sure everything is okay. Now the cool thing also here is that we don't have, let's make this probably a little bit smaller so you can see. All right, the great thing here also is that we don't have to pass anything in the body. So I'm going to just say none, right? And then everything is good. So let's see, make sure it's delete. I'm going to say send, and you can see it says 204, which is exactly what we said to return with empty string there. Very good. Next, let's see how can we update our data through this API. Okay, do the same thing here and put in the root, say quotes, and then we're going to do the same thing because to update something we need to pass in the ID. And then we're going to pass methods, which is going to be put for updating. All right, so let's define update quote and pass the ID. And here we are going to go ahead and say quote again because we need to grab that quote that needs to be updated. We did the same thing we did before. ID is equal to the ID we're passing. Then we know all is good. And I'm going to put all of this, of course, instead of that. This has to be like that. And then, of course, we are going to use the next iterator and put it all together like this. This is Q if Q. Okay, Q also Q like that. Okay, we've seen that before. So now we have our quote, right? We found a quote with that ID, which we want to use to update. To update, we're going to say first if quote, and that's when we're going to say quote that update. We can use this update quote function to then pass in the request.json. Remember, the request is going to be whatever we're passing for us to be able, in this case, to update the quote itself. Okay, that's why we go through request.json, just like what we saw earlier. Okay, once that is done, we're going to just return our JSON-ified and pass the quote, which is what we just updated. So we will see, in this case, what was updated with the new information. And outside the if statement, I'm going to just return the string and then a 404 as such. All right, there we go. Let's go save this and see how this works. And now it's going to be put. That is the method we're going to be using. And we do need to pass something. So we're going to go to body and we're going to raw. And of course, we want JSON. So if you don't see JSON, make sure to click there to find JSON. In this case, I just want the first one. And I'm going to leave that James Bond, say updated. I can remove this new update. Let's go ahead and run this. I pass ID 1 because that is the first item that I want to change. If I go send, and you can see it says here James updated 1 new updated. Refresh, go back to quotes. In this case, just a get, you can see that James, the first one, was updated to James updated, new updated. I can also update Mark Twain, which is the second one, by passing 2, and I can just say copy this, so just to show you. New person, and if I say like that, you can say Mark Twain, and if I refresh, you can see Mark Twain, new person. So those updates are working as expected. So we've learned how to do a CRUD, create, read, update, and delete operations by creating very simple Flask API. Now, this is very basics. Of course, you can put the backend like a database, maybe something that I'm going to show you at a later video. So you can see it wasn't very hard, very simple to get up and running using Flask and Python to create a nice API.